process of how we got to this legislation has several parts. The most important was just the recognition that while it is possible to stop a bad thing, you can never turn around and have a good thing unless you can say what you want. And so the question was, many different parts of civil society in the US, in their specific elements of civil society, had language, rhetorically, to describe what they wanted. They had research and analysis to be very concrete about what they wanted. But the work we needed was to take all the sectors together to build a consensus about what we all wanted, that we could all advocate for together, and then to make that translated into very specific legislative policy language. And in the U.S., since the very early 1991, 1992, there has been very broad, cross-sectoral work on trade and globalization. There's a national coalition called the Citizens Trade Campaign. It is comprised of many of the big national unions, the environmental groups, the family farm groups, the consumer advocacy groups, the faith, the religious groups, civil rights groups, groups that represent the minority rights. And that coalition was the basis, first, of starting to think about this process and working then similarly with another very powerful coalition that John represents, there's John there, the AFL-CIO, the Federation of Labor. And we now, since the beginning of this, have two federations of labor who are involved. The process of coming up with consensus involved the Labor Federation, the cross-sectoral labor federations, the cross-sectoral coalition, and the premises for this were two. Obviously, the first, we need to say what we're for. But politically, we knew two things. In 2006, when we started, yes, we started in 2006. In 2006, when we started, we knew the most important contribution that U.S. civil society could make to the global struggle for fair trade and a new model of globalization was to make sure that George Bush did not have any more trade authority. So the old fast-track delegation was sunsetting anyway in the middle of 2007. And so we started thinking, if we have to make sure he doesn't have more authority to do more of the same, then we need to come in with something else to replace Bush's fast track. And so starting in early 2006, we started working, thinking, negotiating, many texts, many iterations, many hours crossing out, adding in. And at the beginning of the process, in some of the sectors, for instance in labor, there was a very sophisticated idea already of what policy issues were needed to be in the bill. In other sectors, the language had not really been translated to policy. So literally the process that was involved, both to build consensus, but also to make sure we captured the needs of the other movements, was to go to leaders in the other sectors and literally just tape record. If you were the trade negotiator and I was the other person on the table, tell me what you want. And to have the language and then to help translate that into GATTEs, into NAFTAs, into technical language. So we could then capture, for those who were not operating at that level of legal specifics, what they wanted. So we knew we had to come up with something to stop fast track. And that worked, actually, that helped work. And then, as that started to work, and then we realized, we've gotten past fast track. Now there's going to be an election, and the groups that comprise the base, political base of the Democratic Party, need to get ahead of the president and say what we're for. Because when we did not with Clinton, we got NAFTA and WTO. So we knew we needed to actually build consensus among politically important constituencies and make a very bright line. This is it. This is our expectation. And these are all the groups that got you elected. So this is where we need to go. So the substance of what was for the fast track replacement then got borrowed and put into the Trade Act as the new way to use as a new tool, given the new context, so that the content that had been negotiated was then converted to a new vehicle. And that's the history of how that work was done. And for organizations or country coalitions that want to think about replicating it, of course, I can give a lot more detail about the actual process of negotiating. There were cross-sectoral fights of places where there were conflicts between demands or views, and these had to be facilitated into discussions until we could come up with consensus. So not everything everyone would want ideally is there, but the core of what would be a progressive alternative model for trade agreements is very concrete. And the final sort of context of this is, of course, politically. This has allowed us to jiu-jitsu, to turn against the arguments of the critics of the reformers, the people who defend the status quo, always attack the reform demands and say, oh, you people are just against trade. If you don't like WTO and NAFTA, you just don't like trade. And for years we've been saying, that's not true. We want trade. We need different rules. You wrote those rules of NAFTA, WTO. The record shows this has not worked for most people. So we want trade, but different rules, and for investment. And so now that we have come with a trade expansion proposal, we have gone to the Chamber of Commerce and asked them to join us in rebuilding the American consensus in favor of trade expansion. Because here is a path forward. And of course, if they are not for it, might they be protectionist? Might they be isolationist? It's what they've been saying about us when we didn't like their rules. And so now we have our rules, and they can decide if they want to build consensus or if they want to fight about maintaining something that failed. So that's the politics, that's the process. And the final thing I would say is, I think Jeff will talk a little bit about how the bill has been used to hold the political space now as the new president comes in. But in the U.S. in the 2006 and 2008 elections, we have seen a great increase in the use of demands to change, to replace NAFTA and WTO for candidates who have been elected to the parliament. So in those two elections, we have replaced 70 senators and representatives. The ones who voted for NAFTA, CAFTA, WTO are out, replaced by candidates who specifically campaigned and won with a priority on replacing NAFTA, WTO, CAFTA with paid advertising that's focused. So the political dynamic has been for many of these new members to sponsor the Trade Act as the mechanism to actually deliver their campaign commitments. And the final thing I would just note is there's been an enormous amount of grassroots organizing. This has provided concrete hook in the U.S., both to push for alternatives that we want, but also there is nothing as good as a strong offense to have a strong defense. And so having now almost half of the congressional Democrats sponsored onto a bill that says this is how we're going forward, this is what we are for, including many of the senior members, means that those who want to just pick up Bush's agenda and make it Obama's agenda have basically hit a wall. And part of the campaigning that's happened has been most has been grassroots. So in congressional districts all over the country, the coalition partners come together and meet with the congressman.